President Aristide, and citizens of a free and democratic Haiti. For centuries, the Haitian people have known little more than blood and terror. You have been robbed of opportunity and deprived of basic rights. Now you have a chance to make real the dreams of those who liberated your nation nearly 200 years ago.
In March of 1995, President Bill Clinton delivered a speech in Haiti. Standing by his side was the first democratically elected president in Haiti's history, Bertrand Aristide. I promise that's the last time I'll speak French. Aristide had been elected 5 years earlier, but was overthrown in a military coup 9 months after taking office. Now he was back in power, and President Clinton had come to celebrate.
Today, we celebrate the restoration of democracy to your country.
But what Clinton had left out of this triumphal narrative was how the U.S. had played a key role in keeping Aristide out of power for so long. During the 3 years that the military was in power, Aristide became a symbol of defiance in the face of tyranny, a revolutionary humanitarian politician who demanded radical change for Haiti's millions of impoverished citizens. By the time the military finally stepped down, President Aristide returned to his post a diminished figure, hamstrung by power-sharing agreements and almost completely beholden to the United States. This is the story of Haiti's coup. "1990 was a year of transition. The Berlin Wall had come down. The Soviet Union was on its last legs. The Cold War was ending, and the spirit of revolution was in the air. Until 1986, Haiti had been ruled by ruthless father and son dictators, the Duvaliers. The fall of Jean-Claude Duvalier in 1986 led to a chaotic and violent interregnum. Both military leaders and political statesmen battled it out for control of Haiti until, in 1990, the United Nations conducted the first apparently fair presidential election in Haiti's history. Bertrand Aristide, a priest and human rights advocate, was elected with 67% of the vote. In a nation crippled by intergenerational systemic poverty, and where the wealthiest Haitians, along with foreign investors, controlled most of the country's land and resources, Aristide had become a champion of the rights of the poor. Aristide was a liberation theologist, a Christian philosophy that advocates engaging in class warfare on behalf of the poor.
Si vraiment ils reconnaissent avoir volé, si vraiment ils reconnaissent avoir volé à travers leurs compatriotes, tout au long du processus de colonisation, si vraiment ils veulent dire à la face du monde entier qu'ils sont développés, qu'ils commencent à ne pas avoir pitié d'Haïti. Nous n'avons pas besoin de pitié, nous. Qu'ils commencent à ne pas avoir pitié de nous, mais à reconnaître le droit que nous avons, droit de récupérer un peu de ce qu'ils ont volé. Alors, ils pourront se dire des personnes humaines qui transcendent le matériel pour déboucher sur une dimension spirituelle où la personne humaine se développe continuellement et n'ose pas appeler quelqu'un qui l'a exploité un sous-développé quand lui-même, il est le premier sous-développé.
Liberation theology was inspiring political movements all across the world, especially in the global South. But its proximity to Marxist ideas made it a target for suspicion and violence. Aristide himself survived no less than 3 assassination attempts in the 1980s. As president, Aristide worked toward doubling the minimum wage, building massive public works projects, including schools, enacting tax reforms to make the wealthy pay their fair share, supporting trade unions, and levying higher duties on American companies operating in Haiti. Aristide's ambitious programs worried many U.S. investors used to making lucrative deals through the Haitian aristocracy at the expense of its impoverished masses. But events in Haiti didn't gain nearly as much public attention as they did in September 1991, when Aristide was deposed in a military coup. President Aristide was spirited out of the country by a cadre of CIA-trained Haitian military and police operatives who took control of the government. The de facto leader, top-ranking General Raúl Cedras, instituted a brutal crackdown on Aristide's supporters. Death squads roamed the streets, killing and torturing at will. One group, the Front for the Advancement and Progress of Haiti, played an especially brutal role in what was ultimately the deaths of over 3,000 of Aristide's supporters. It was led by a man named Emmanuel Constant, who was later revealed to be in the employ of the CIA.
He said he was given a code name, Gamal, and an agency walkie-talkie so the CIA could summon him at a moment's notice. And he says he went on the payroll at around $700 a month.
I was meeting with the CIA on a regular basis. We had an understanding, we had an alliance. So if I'm guilty of those crimes that they're accusing me of, the CIA is also guilty.
Because they knew what you were doing?
Because they knew exactly what I was doing.
The political terror in Haiti prompted many Haitians to brave the dangerous boat trip across the Caribbean in hopes of claiming asylum in the United States. Fearing an impending refugee crisis, President George H.W. Bush sent U.S. Navy ships to intercept refugees and return them to Haiti, where they often faced torture and death. It was largely condemned as an inhumane policy, and Bush's opponent in the 1992 race for president spared no opportunity to criticize the policy.
If I were president, I would give them temporary asylum until we restored the elected government of Haiti.
Clinton's criticisms of President Bush did not end up dominating the more domestic issues-oriented 1992 election. But in Haiti, his words sparked hope of escaping the horrors of the Cedras regime. During his transition, President-elect Clinton received an intelligence briefing from the CIA, telling him that on January 20th, the day of his inauguration, 150,000 boats were to set off from Haiti for the coast of Florida. Even the normally laconic Vice President Gore admitted, "This is something to consider." Clinton's national security advisor, Sandy Berger, explains.
President Bush had instituted a policy of return. He intercepted the boats and took the people back to Haiti. That seemed to be, from candidate Clinton's perspective, a very difficult moral position. So, he said during the campaign that he would no longer return people to Haiti if they chose to come to the U.S. It was not a well-considered decision. Were there political considerations? There are a lot of Haitians in New York.
Now President Clinton had a dilemma. A brutal military dictatorship had taken hold of the government of Haiti. Its president, Bertrand Aristide, was in exile in Washington, and potentially hundreds of thousands of Haitian refugees were about to make the dangerous trek to the Florida coast. Some predicted 1/3 of the boats would likely capsize along the way. Feeling pushed into a corner, Clinton reluctantly chose to maintain the very Bush-era policy that he had made such an issue of during the election. Clinton was criticized on all sides for this decision, particularly by the Congressional Black Caucus, but Clinton held firm. Rather than give the refugees sanctuary, he promised to focus efforts on restoring the Aristide government, thus removing the whole reason for the mass exodus. While the status of refugees tied up the American court system and provoked protests out on the streets, Clinton got to work. But finding a solution turned out to be far more complex than it seemed at first. From the outset, there was a pressure on Clinton from the Pentagon, the CIA, as well as U.S. corporations to use President Aristide's reliance on American power to pressure him to give up or at least modify his more socialist inclinations. No one in the American government wanted to see Aristide return, only to lead a communist revolt. Haiti's economic inequality had been a godsend for American business. Corporations like Disney and Walmart relied on low-wage sweatshop labor to produce cheap products for its consumers. Haiti's aristocrats relied on their patronage to stay in power. Aristide had made so many enemies rocking the boat in Haiti that it wasn't even clear how deep the conspiracy against him went. The Clinton administration began to understand that even if Aristide were to return to power, he'd need to be a wholly different kind of leader, one who'd have to share power with the old order. Otherwise, he could easily be toppled again. In July 1993, an agreement was drawn up by the United States and signed by both Aristide and General Cedras. The Governor's Island Agreement set a timeline for handing power back to Aristide. The agreement largely favored the old order and required Aristide not only to return with less power, but to grant amnesty to hundreds, if not thousands, of coup plotters. Although Aristide held up his end of the agreement, the violence and repression of the military continued, and the agreement slowly unraveled. The UN called for heavy pressure on the military junta to force them out, but the US stood in the way, stopping or slowing new sanctions, opposing an international embargo on Haiti, and putting pressure on Aristide to make more compromises. By February 1994, US-backed pro-democracy groups were leaning heavily on Aristide to agree to new and even more restrictive terms. There's this fallacy in anti-imperialist discourses that the United States always supports the most vicious and ghoulish right-wing regimes it possibly can. In reality, the US much prefers to have a government with some claim to being democratic rather than a violent military junta killing people in the streets and calling international attention to the situation. Thus, it became the Clinton policy to use the situation to tie Aristide to the kind of neoliberal policies Clinton and the American establishment had embraced since the late 1970s. As governor of Arkansas, Clinton had transformed his state into a major hub for foreign investment. Candidate Clinton would often tout his record in Arkansas as a sign that he was the kind of leader who could take the United States into the global market. Of course, Arkansas itself remained one of the poorest states with the lowest paying jobs in the country. Even so, Clinton was able to somehow credibly pitch himself as an alternative to Reaganomics.
The most important distinction in this campaign is that I represent real hope for change, a departure from trickle-down economics, a departure from tax and spend economics to invest and grow.
Clinton's neoliberal reforms would actually build on Reaganomics and would heavily inform his view of Haiti for his entire life. Negotiations between Clinton, Aristide, and the military junta continued throughout the summer and into the fall. Pressures mounted due to another refugee crisis taking place in Cuba. The urgency to resolve the Haiti situation boiled over, and on September 16th, President Clinton addressed the nation.
Haiti's dictators, led by General Russel, control the most violent regime in our hemisphere. For 3 years, they have rejected every peaceful solution that the international community has proposed. Now the United States must protect our interests, to stop the brutal atrocities that threaten tens of thousands of Haitians, to secure our borders, and to preserve stability and promote democracy in our hemisphere. Earlier today, I ordered Secretary of Defense Perry to call up the military reserve personnel necessary to support United States troops in any action we might undertake in Haiti. I have also ordered 2 aircraft carriers, the USS Eisenhower and the USS America, into the region. I issued these orders after giving full consideration to what is at stake. The message of the United States to the Haitian dictators is clear. Your time is up. Leave now, or we will force you from power.
As Clinton's forces prepared for battle, he decided to make one last effort at a peaceful resolution. He sent former President Jimmy Carter to Port-au-Prince to try and work out a last-minute deal with General Cedras. Since retirement, Carter had become a kind of goodwill ambassador, monitoring elections, mediating disputes, and promoting human rights around the world. One of Carter's greatest triumphs of his presidency was the Camp David peace accords, ending decades of bloodshed between Egypt and Israel. And since retirement, Carter was looking for ways to repeat his diplomatic miracle. The summer before his visit to Haiti, Carter had gone to North Korea and ostensibly got Chairman Kim Jong-il.
Kim Il-sung, this is not Kim Jong-il, I am stupid. Kim died a month after this, so you can understand how I made this mistake. Anyway, back to the video.
And ostensibly got Chairman Kim Jong-il to agree to denuclearize. But North Korea almost immediately ignored the agreement. Arriving in Port-au-Prince, Carter saw an opportunity to help restore peace in Haiti and possibly prevent President Clinton's invasion from taking place. Clinton himself was anxious to avoid the attack, which he worried would be unpopular in the Congress and potentially inaugurate a long and disastrous occupation. On the evening of September 18th, the bombers left Fort Meade airfield, while aircraft carriers filled with thousands of Marines set sail for Port-au-Prince. Carter was still in Haiti and had gone MIA. President Clinton called and called from the Oval Office until he finally reached Carter. Carter insisted he was close to an agreement with Cedras. The president tried discreetly to warn Carter that an attack was on its way without tipping off Cedras. The clock was ticking, talks were dragging, and now President Carter was in a tight spot. Then, at the 11th hour, word came down. Carter had made the deal.
Success in Port-au-Prince, the Haitian capital tonight. Former President Jimmy Carter, along with former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell, and Senator Sam Nunn, have reached an agreement with the military rulers in Haiti that they will step down from power, and Bertrand Aristide, the elected president who they overthrew in 1991, will be able to go home.
Bill Clinton now appears to have a foreign policy success.
Cedras had agreed to step down in 3 weeks. Clinton called off the attack.
This is a good agreement for the United States and for Haiti. The military leaders will leave. The United States and coalition forces will arrive beginning tomorrow, and they'll do so in conditions that are less dangerous, although still not without risk. It will be much easier to preserve human rights, and there is a real chance of a more orderly and less violent transfer of power. And to the supporters of President Aristide, he will be returned. I ask that all Haitians remember what President Aristide said just a couple of days ago. No vengeance, no violence, no retribution. This is a time for peace.
20,000 Marines continued on to Port-au-Prince to ensure the agreement was carried through and that Aristide was safely inaugurated. General Cedras had played his cards to the bitter end, managing to secure escape for himself and an impressively long list of apparent family members, while hanging on to piles of oil and drug money he'd extorted from the country during his 3-year rule. President Aristide granted broad amnesty to almost everyone involved in the coup, and on October 15, 1994, he was restored as Haiti's president. In the heady days following the end of the Cold War, a spirit of revolution had gripped the planet. Across the globe, nations embraced liberal democratic reform, believing the life, liberty, and prosperity that had blessed America could be theirs as well. But what many of these countries didn't fully understand was just how undemocratic and corporatized the United States had become over the course of the Cold War. Reformers like Aristide may have imagined a fair relationship with the American empire was possible through mimicking its political system, holding free and fair elections observed by international agencies.
We appeal to the international community to make itself responsible for progressively creating a civilization of peace.
But the changes he wanted for his people were the very changes the U.S. could not afford to allow to take place. More than Haiti's prosperity, the United States needed Haiti to have a stable government, preferably an elected one, but more crucially, one which upheld the corrupt social order from which the United States economically benefited. The Haiti which Aristide came to rule was one set back on its old course. Its future would be shaped by the old aristocracy, foreign investment, and international organizations like USAID, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, rather than its own people. Aristide's ability to bring about social welfare programs for the poor had been severely restricted by the agreement which had restored him to power. In 2004, he was again deposed in a coup, this time for good.
President Aristide resigned. He has left his country. The Constitution of Haiti is working. There is an interim president, as per the Constitution, in place.
Today, Haitians have a mixed view of the country's first democratically elected president. For his part, Bill Clinton did not cease playing an active role in Haitian politics after he left office. The Clinton Foundation invested great sums of money in organizations ostensibly for Haiti's development. Clinton worked to persuade the Haitian government to spend foreign aid and tax dollars on turning Haiti into a playground for foreign investment, just as he'd done in Arkansas. Clinton's programs provided pretty pictures for PowerPoint presentations, but failed to meet the challenge of helping Haiti adapt to the global market. And that's because, frankly, helping Haiti was never really the point. The point was to keep the footprint of American empire in Haiti and to maintain a status quo which allowed the U.S. to continue to get rich off the backs of the Haitian proletariat. Will Haiti ever find a way to be truly sovereign and prosperous in a world dominated by massive militarized capitalist empires? It's hard to see how, but as always, history will have the last word. Thanks everyone for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Want to remind you to like the video, subscribe to this channel please, and share this video on Twitter or Reddit or wherever you share videos. Go ahead and donate to my Patreon page and become a supporter. We have 11 supporters already and they're fantastic. Send a question to me on Curious Cat. I will answer it here on the channel. Those links are in the description below. And I just want to say that I am not an expert on Haitian history and politics. This video is just meant to make you aware of a story you may not know about, to entertain you a little bit, and also to make you curious. So curious that you might go out and research more about the topic. And I've provided a ton of links in the description so that you can do just that. If you find any good tidbits or anything you think contradicts my version of the story here in this video, please share it in the comments. We want to expand our knowledge and learn more about these topics. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and I will see you soon.